Hop-Frog by Edgar Allan Poe, published 1849, read by Gems. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good joke of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been able quite to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis interis. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghost of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with the length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than the verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools who wore motley, with caps and bells, and were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice in consideration for the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in a way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was troubled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days. Days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it is no small source of self-gratulation that our king, that, in Hop-Frog, for this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop-Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of several ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop-Frog could only get along by a sort of injectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a moment that afforded illimitable amusement and a course of consolation to the king, for, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop-Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power by which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms, by way of compensation for deficiency in his lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hop-Frog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop-Frog and a young girl, very less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the 2 little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop-Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, and it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her great grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted, so she possessed much more influence and never failed to use it, however she could, for the benefit of Hop-Frog. On some great state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, the talents, both of Hop-Frog and Trippetta, were sure to be called into play. Hop-Frog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters and arranging costumes for masked balls that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device that could possibly give eclat to a masquerade. The whole court was in fever of expectation. As for the costumes and characters, it might be well supposed that everybody had come to the decision of such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they would assume, a week or even a month in advance, and in fact there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated I could never tell, unless they did it in a way of a joke. More probably, they found it difficult on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and as a last resort they sent for Trippetta and Hop-Frog. When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting in his wine with the 7 members of his cabinet council. But the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hop-Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hop-Frog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hop-Frog," he said as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hop-Frog sighed. "And then let us have the benefit of your inventions. We want characters, man, something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with the everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits." Hop-Frog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest to reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant. "Ah, ha, ha!" roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a good glass of wine can do? Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow. His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of the wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked around upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the prime minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us. Ha, ha, ha." And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the 7. Hop-Frog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. Come, said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring!" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster, "or by the fields." The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced on the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss as what to say, or do, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best as she could and, not even endeavoring to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. "What? What? What are you doing making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered, in great measure, from his intoxication and looked fixedly but quietly at the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, "I? I? How could it have been me?" "The sound appeared to come without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window wetting his bill upon his cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Whereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper, with no very particular ill effect, Hop-Frog entered at once and with spirit into the plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell what was the association of idea," observed he very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life. "But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, And while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades. But here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires the company of 8 persons and— "Here we are," cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. "8 to a fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?" "Well, we call it," replied the cripple, "the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hop-Frog, "lies in the fright it occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministers. "I will equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you all for real beasts, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop-Frog, I will make a man of you." "The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inevitable." "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop-Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarfs were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness of nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were encased in tight-fitting stocking-net shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, some of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as an orangutan was much more efficiently representative of flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, it formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop-Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters, at right angles, across the circle, after the same fashion adopted at the present day by those who captured chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand salon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at the top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight, and lowered or elevated by means of the counterbalance as usual. But, in order to not look unsightly, this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of this room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the salon, could not all be expected to keep out of the center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional scones were set in various parts of the hall out of the war, and a flambeau emitting sweet odors was placed on the right hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop-Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with the masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they all rushed, or rather rolled in altogether, for the impediments of their change caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who had supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expedited their frolic in their own blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, at the dwarf's suggestion. The keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier originally hung, and which had been drawn up to its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn up far upward as to take the hook out of its reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders, by this time, had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and, beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me," now screamed Hop-Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din. "Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. If only I can get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall. Seizing the flamboy from one of the caryatides, he returned, as he went, to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey among the king's heads, and thus clambered a few feet above the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew up violently for about 30 feet, dangling with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans and leaving them suspended in midair between the skylight and the floor. Hop-Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a low, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But on this present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth, and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said at length the infuriated jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now." Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames suddenly increasing in virulence forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach. And, as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized this opportunity and once more spoke. "I now see distinctly," said he, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are the great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop-Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest." Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely up to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the salon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was ever seen again.